Before we begin, drop a comment below with your country and what time it is right now where you're watching. Whether it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in France, I want to know. Don't just sit back. Tell me where in the world you are. Now let's dive into the story. The general's boot struck the concrete with a sound like a judge's gavel. Major Elara Voss stood in the dim briefing room at Forward Operating Base Kestrel, her shoulders squared despite the 3-day dust coating her uniform. The winter air in the Afghan highlands bit through the cracked window, but she didn't flinch. General Marcus Thorne circled her like a wolf examining wounded prey, his jaw tight with something between fury and disbelief. 6 officers lined the walls, their faces blank masks hiding whatever thoughts churned behind their eyes. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows that made everyone look like ghosts. She'd been pulled from a convoy escort mission without explanation, driven through hostile territory in the dead of night, and now stood here facing a court of judgment she didn't understand. "State your call sign, Major." General Thorne's voice cut through the silence like a blade through silk. His words weren't a request. They were a test, a challenge, maybe even a trap. Elara felt her heart kick against her ribs, but her face remained stone. She'd learned long ago that showing fear in rooms like this was the same as bleeding in shark-infested waters. The general's eyes were dark pits that seemed to see through her skull into memories she'd buried deep. Behind him, a map of the Korangal Valley spread across the wall, red pins marking recent attacks. 3 American casualties in the past week. 2 British, 1 Canadian, all from sniper fire so precise it defied explanation. The enemy had a ghost in these mountains, and something in the general's expression told her that ghost was why she was here. "Major Voss, Echo Company, sir," she said, her voice steady despite the confusion spiraling through her mind. That wasn't what he wanted. She knew it the moment his eyes narrowed, the moment his jaw muscle twitched. He stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the coffee on his breath and see the sleepless nights carved into the lines around his eyes. The other officers shifted, leather creaking, feet scuffing. One cleared his throat. Another exhaled slowly through his nose. The tension in the room pressed against her chest like a physical weight, making each breath feel deliberate and measured. "Not your unit designation," General Thorne said, his voice dropping to something dangerous and quiet. "Your real call sign, the one you earned. The one you used before you buried it in paperwork and reassignment requests." His finger jabbed toward her chest, stopping just short of touching her. The one that made enemy combatants put down their weapons on Christmas Eve 7 years ago, because they thought the angel of death herself was hunting them through the snow. The room went still, deathly still. Even the humming lights seemed to hold their breath. Elara's mind raced backward through time, through snow-covered mountains in a different war, through the scope of a rifle that felt like an extension of her soul, through the weight of decisions that saved hundreds of lives and cost her everything she thought she knew about herself. Her mouth went dry. Her hands, which never trembled even under enemy fire, suddenly felt unsteady. 7 years. 7 years since she'd spoken that name aloud. 7 years since she'd looked through a scope and made choices that turned her into a legend soldiers whispered about in mess halls and a ghost she'd been running from ever since. The general wanted her to say it. He needed to hear it from her lips to confirm whatever intelligence had landed on his desk. Around her, the officers leaned forward imperceptibly, hungry for the answer. Outside, somewhere in the darkness of the Afghan night, an enemy sniper was killing her people with the same precision she'd once used to save them. And General Thorne, with his knowing eyes and his deliberate silence, was waiting for her to become the weapon she'd sworn never to be again. She drew in a breath that felt like swallowing broken glass. "Specter Six, sir." The Georgian mountains wore their winter like armor, white and brutal and unforgiving. Lieutenant Elara Voss pressed her eye to the scope, her breath creating tiny clouds of frost in the air before her face. The town of Skinvali spread below like a broken toy, smoke rising from shelled buildings, snow stained with ash and worse things she didn't let herself think about. It was December 23rd, and the Russian advance had trapped 200 Georgian civilians in a church on the eastern edge of town. Command said evacuation was impossible. Command said the church would be overrun by morning. Command said to hold position and wait for orders that might never come. Elara had stopped listening to command 3 hours ago when she heard children crying through her radio headset. Her spotter, Sergeant Finn Carrick, lay beside her in the snow, his weathered face barely visible beneath his white camouflage hood. They'd been partners for 2 years, and he could read her thoughts better than she could sometimes. "Rules of engagement say we observe and report," he murmured, his Irish accent soft as falling snow. "They don't say nothing about what you're thinking, Voss." She didn't answer. Below, Russian infantry moved in formation toward the church, their numbers overwhelming, their intent clear. International observers had fled. Georgian forces were scattered and broken. And somewhere in that stone building with its ancient walls and shattered stained glass, families huddled together wondering if they'd see Christmas morning. Elara's finger rested beside the trigger guard of her M24 rifle. She'd made this shot 1,000 times in training, 500 times in combat. Wind speed 4 miles per hour from the northwest. Temperature -8 Celsius. Distance 1,200 meters. The calculations ran through her mind like a prayer she'd memorized in a language she didn't speak but understood in her bones. One shot could change everything. One shot could also end her career, court-martial her, brand her as a rogue operator who defied orders. But one shot might also give those families in that church a chance to see their children open presents on Christmas morning. The choice pressed against her chest heavier than her tactical vest. "They're just soldiers following orders," Finn said quietly, reading her internal debate. "Farm boys conscripted from Siberia who probably hate this war as much as anyone." He was right. She knew he was right. But rightness didn't change the mathematics of the situation. The Russian unit had 3 officers. Take them out, and the advance would stall, confusion would ripple through the ranks, and in that chaos, those civilians might escape into the forest. Her scope settled on the lead officer, a captain by his insignia, young enough to be her brother. He was talking into a radio, probably coordinating the final assault. In another life, maybe they'd have been friends. In this life, he stood between children and Christmas morning. The world narrowed to the crosshairs. Her heartbeat slowed, falling into the rhythm Finn had taught her, the rhythm that made impossible shots possible. Christmas Eve tomorrow. She thought about her own childhood. Her father reading the nativity story by firelight, her mother singing Silent Night in a voice like honey and smoke. That Russian captain probably had similar memories. But those memories didn't stop his unit from moving toward that church like a slow avalanche. Elara whispered a prayer she didn't know she remembered, squeezed the trigger with the gentleness of touching a sleeping child's face, and watched through her scope as the captain crumpled into the snow. The sound of the shot echoed through the mountains like thunder, and everything changed forever. Within seconds, she fired twice more, and the Russian advance dissolved into chaos as leaderless soldiers scattered for cover, buying time measured in heartbeats and miracles. The extraction took 18 hours of crawling through snow that wanted to swallow them whole. By the time Elara and Finn reached the forward base, frost had turned their uniforms into ice armor and their faces into death masks. But the civilians from Skinvali Church were alive, evacuated through the chaos her shots had created, loaded onto trucks and driven to safety, while Russian forces argued about ghosts in the mountains. Command didn't court-martial her. They didn't praise her either. Instead, she was summoned to a secure room where men in suits without name tags asked questions that felt like scalpels cutting into her soul. They wanted to know how she'd made those shots. They wanted to understand the decisions she'd made. Most of all, they wanted to know if she could do it again. "You saved 200 lives," said one of the suits, a man with gray temples and eyes like frozen lakes. "You also violated direct orders and engaged enemy forces without authorization." He let that hang in the air like smoke. Elara sat straight in her chair, exhaustion pressing down on her shoulders but refusing to show it. "I took a calculated risk based on battlefield conditions, sir," she said, her voice level. 3 precision shots to create confusion and enable civilian evacuation. No collateral damage. Mission parameters achieved. The suits exchanged glances. One smiled, thin and sharp. Another made a note on a tablet. The gray-templed man leaned forward, folding his hands on the table between them. "Lieutenant Voss, how do you feel about serving in a more specialized capacity?" That's how she became Specter Six. No ceremony, no fanfare, just reassignment orders that moved her into a unit that officially didn't exist and unofficially saved more lives than anyone would ever know. They gave her better equipment, a new spotter who'd trained with British SAS, and missions that made Skinvali look like practice. She hunted human traffickers in Bosnia, providing overwatch for raids that freed dozens of enslaved women. She eliminated a warlord in Somalia who'd been recruiting child soldiers. One shot through a window during his dinner. She protected UN convoys in Syria, her rifle speaking from ridgelines where enemy forces never saw her coming. Each mission was surgical. Each shot was deliberate. And slowly, across continents and conflicts, whispers began spreading about a female sniper who appeared like smoke and disappeared like mist. The legends grew larger than the truth, as legends always do. Enemy combatants claimed she could shoot through walls, that she never missed, that she was a demon sent to punish the wicked. Allied forces called her guardian angel, the invisible hand that kept them alive when everything went sideways. Elara heard the stories and felt nothing. She wasn't a demon or an angel. She was a woman with a rifle who made hard choices in impossible situations because someone had to and she'd proven she could. The weight of those choices settled into her bones like winter cold, present but manageable as long as she kept moving forward. Then came Christmas Eve in Kandahar. Elara was providing overwatch for a humanitarian convoy, delivering supplies to an orphanage outside the city. Taliban forces had set up an ambush. 30 fighters dug into positions overlooking the only road in. The convoy had 40 aid workers and enough food and medicine to see 200 orphan children through the winter. Elara's spotter counted the enemy positions, his voice tight with the mathematics of an impossible situation. "Specter 6, you can't take them all. We need to abort." But Elara looked through her scope at the convoy below, at the aid workers who believed goodness could survive in war zones, at the children who would go hungry if that convoy turned back. She thought about Christmas 7 years ago in those Georgian mountains, about the choice that had started everything. "Get me targets," she said quietly. And for the next 4 hours, as the sun set on Christmas Eve, Specter 6 became a ghost story written in precision fire and impossible shots. She moved positions after every 3 rounds, never staying still long enough for return fire to find her. She picked off Taliban fighters with such methodical accuracy that the survivors began abandoning their weapons and fleeing into the desert, convinced they were fighting something supernatural. The convoy rolled through without a single casualty. The orphanage received its supplies. And somewhere in the darkness, exhausted and empty, Elara Voss realized she'd become exactly what the legend said. A weapon so effective she'd forgotten how to be anything else. That night, she submitted her resignation from the program. They accepted it 6 months later, after debriefings and psychological evaluations and quiet conversations about what happens to soldiers who carry too much weight for too long. She requested transfer to regular infantry command, buried her call sign in classified files, and tried to forget that Specter 6 had ever existed. Present day. General Thorne's office smelled like old leather and bad decisions. Elara sat across from him, the weight of her spoken call sign still hanging between them like cordite smoke. He slid a manila folder across the desk, photographs spilling out like accusations. Each image showed the same thing. American soldiers killed by single shots from impossible distances, their bodies positioned with almost surgical precision. 12 dead in 3 weeks, the general said, his voice rough as gravel under boots. British, Canadian, American, all special forces. All killed by someone who knows exactly what they're doing. He tapped one photograph, a young sergeant from Texas whose smile in his service photo could have lit up a stadium. This boy's mother will never recover. None of them will. Elara forced herself to look at each photograph, to see the faces, to acknowledge what precision fire looked like when it came from the wrong side. These soldiers weren't her kills, but they could have been. Same methodology, same cold efficiency. Same understanding that sometimes one bullet could change everything. "You think I did this?" she said quietly, not a question. General Thorne's laugh was bitter and short. If I thought you did this, you'd be in chains, not sitting in my office. No, Major. I think someone who knows your methodology is using it against us. I think someone studied your operations, learned your techniques, and turned them into a weapon aimed at our people. The implications crashed through her mind like artillery fire. During her years as Specter Six, she trained others, shared techniques, written after-action reports that detailed her decision-making process. Those documents were classified, but classification meant nothing in the age of WikiLeaks and insider threats. Someone had access to her playbook, and they were using it to kill soldiers with the same precision she'd once used to save them. The thought made her stomach twist. She'd spent 7 years trying to escape being a weapon, and now someone else was using her blueprints to become one. Who's the target demographic? She asked, sliding back into tactical thinking like pulling on old boots that still fit despite years in a closet. All the victims are counterinsurgency specialists, all working on winning hearts and minds, building schools, training local police. Someone's specifically hunting soldiers who make our presence more humane, more sustainable. General Thorne nodded slowly, impressed or disturbed or both. Which means our enemy isn't just trying to kill Americans. They're trying to make us into the monsters they need us to be. Remove the good operators. Leave the heavy-handed ones. Watch the locals turn against us. Elara stood, pacing to the window that overlooked the base. Outside, soldiers moved through their routines, unaware that someone was hunting their brothers and sisters with techniques she'd pioneered. Snow had started falling, light and innocent, catching the floodlights like falling stars. It should have been beautiful. Instead, it reminded her of Skinvali, of the moment she'd become something more than human and less than whole. You want me to hunt the hunter, she said, her reflection in the window looking older than her 34 years. Behind her, the general's silence was answer enough. After 7 years of running from who she'd been, the past had finally caught up with her, wearing her own face and holding her own weapon. The only question left was whether she was still good enough to stop it. The Korangal Valley earned its nickname, the Valley of Death, with American blood spilled across 15 years of fighting. Elara stood at the insertion point watching the sun rise over mountains that had killed better soldiers than her. Her gear heavy with purpose she'd thought she'd never carry again. Her new spotter was Corporal Aisha Kamathi, a Kenyan-British woman whose file read like fiction. Olympic shooting team before joining the military, 3 tours in hostile territories, fluent in 4 languages, and possessed of a dark humor that suggested she'd seen enough horror to either break or adapt. They'd spent 2 days together, and already Elara trusted her in the way soldiers trust people who might have to drag them out of hell. Your legend's bigger than you are? Aisha said conversationally as they hiked into the mountains, their breath creating frost ghosts in the thin air. Soldiers tell Specter Six stories like campfire tales. The Christmas sniper who never missed, who could shoot prayers through scope glass. Elara adjusted her pack, feeling the weight of her M24 rifle strapped across it like carrying a piece of her own skeleton. Legends are lies we tell to make sense of chaos, she replied. I'm just someone who made hard choices and lived long enough to regret them. Aisha laughed, short and sharp. I've read your after-action reports, ma'am. The classified ones that required 3 levels of clearance. You didn't just make hard choices. You made impossible ones and hit every target anyway. They established their first observation post in a cave that smelled like wolf dens and ancient stone. From here, they could see 3 valleys, for villages, and countless positions where an enemy sniper might nest. Elara assembled her rifle with practiced efficiency, each component fitting together like a puzzle she'd solved 1,000 times. The scope clicked into place, and suddenly the world became measurable distances and wind calculations and the terrible responsibility of holding someone's life in crosshairs. He'll show himself eventually, she murmured, scanning the landscape. Snipers are patient, but everyone makes mistakes. Aisha settled beside her with their observation equipment, her own rifle at ready. What if he's not a he? What if she learned from the best? The question hung between them like smoke. For 3 days, they watched and waited, eating cold rations and sleeping in 2-hour shifts, while snow accumulated on the cave entrance like a curtain trying to hide them from the world. Elara studied the enemy's patterns, the spacing between kills, the methodical selection of targets. Whoever the sniper was, they understood psychological warfare as well as physical. Each kill sent ripples of fear through Allied forces, made soldiers hesitate before leaving cover, eroded the confidence that kept units functioning in hostile territory. It was strategic brilliance wearing murder's face, and Elara recognized her own fingerprints all over it. She taught courses on this very thing, how one sniper could paralyze an entire battalion if they understood not just ballistics but human psychology. On the fourth day, as purple dawn light painted the mountains, movement caught her scope. A shepherd with goats moving across a ridge 3 valleys over, except the shepherd moved wrong, with a soldier's economy of motion rather than a civilian's casual wandering. Elara's heartbeat slowed into that familiar rhythm, the one that made time feel elastic and each breath deliberate as prayer. "Got something," she whispered to Aisha, who immediately brought up digital spotting equipment. Together they watched the figure move into position behind an outcrop that provided perfect sight lines to an American patrol route scheduled to run in 2 hours. The shepherd was setting up, getting comfortable, preparing for a kill shot that would add another name to the casualty list. "Range," Aisha whispered. 1,400 meters. Wind 8 miles per hour southwest. Temperature -3 Celsius. Moving target intermittent behind rock cover. Elara's mind calculated automatically, muscle memory from years of practice processing variables faster than conscious thought. This was the shot that would announce her presence, that would tell the enemy sniper that someone was hunting them now. No more surprise. No more invisible advantage. Once she fired, it became a game of cat and mouse where both players had teeth and neither could afford to blink. Her finger rested beside the trigger guard. The shepherd settled into position, rifle emerging from beneath robes that had hidden it. Somewhere below, American soldiers were drinking coffee and checking equipment, unaware they had minutes before someone tried to end their lives with a single bullet. Elara thought about Christmas Eve 7 years ago, about the Russian captain in her crosshairs, about the moment she'd chosen to become a weapon. She'd spent 7 years trying to be something else. But watching this enemy sniper prepare to kill, she understood with crystalline certainty that some choices weren't about what we want to be but about who we have to be when others' lives hang in the balance. She exhaled slowly, squeezed the trigger with the gentleness of a mother's touch, and watched through her scope as the shepherd crumpled into the snow, their weapon clattering against stone. The mountains echoed with thunder, and Specter 6 was back. The countershot came 6 seconds after Elara fired. Rock exploded 3 feet to her left, shrapnel singing through the air where her head had been before Aisha yanked her backward. They rolled deeper into the cave as a second round punched through the space they'd occupied. So close Elara felt the pressure wave against her face. "Secondary sniper," Aisha shouted, already breaking down their observation equipment with controlled panic. They set a trap. The shepherd was bait. Elara's mind raced through the implications even as her hands automatically safed her rifle and prepared for immediate extraction. The enemy wasn't one sniper. It was a team coordinated and smart enough to use her own tactics against her. They'd positioned a primary target knowing someone would take the shot, then had a spotter track the firing position for immediate counterfire. They moved through the mountains like hunted deer, switching positions every 30 minutes, never skylining themselves against ridges, using every depression and boulder for cover. Behind them, Elara could feel the pursuit like physical pressure against her spine. Somewhere in these mountains, an enemy team was tracking them with the same skills she possessed, the same training she'd helped develop. It was like fighting her own shadow, except her shadow had learned all her moves and anticipated her thinking. "How did they know we'd be there?" Aisha gasped as they scrambled up a scree slope, stones sliding treacherously beneath their boots. Elara didn't answer because she was thinking the same thing and didn't like where the thought led. They holed up in a dried riverbed as darkness fell, both women breathing hard, gear soaked with sweat despite the freezing temperature. Elara's hands shook slightly, not from fear but from the adrenaline crash that came after near-death experiences. She'd forgotten this feeling, the animal awareness that came from being prey instead of predator. For 7 years she'd been regular infantry command, making decisions from relative safety, directing others rather than putting herself in crosshairs. Now she remembered why she'd left this life. Because living on the knife edge between life and death required shutting down parts of yourself that made you human, and she'd spent 7 years trying to reclaim those parts. "We need to abort," Aisha said quietly, checking her rifle for damage from their rapid extraction. "Call in air support, level the whole valley if necessary. This isn't about ego anymore, ma'am. They have our position, they have our tactics, and they have home terrain advantage." She was right. Tactically, strategically, logically right. Calling for extraction and overwhelming force was the smart play, the one that kept them alive and eliminated the threat through superior firepower. But Elara looked up at the stars beginning to emerge in the darkening sky and thought about those 12 dead soldiers, about their families who'd never get closure, about an enemy sniper who would disappear like smoke if they brought in the hammer of American air power. Personal kills could be avenged with overwhelming force. But psychological victory, that required facing your enemy on equal terms and proving you were better. "They knew our position because they're reading our playbook," Elara said slowly, pieces clicking together in her mind like rifle components. "Every move I make, they anticipate because they've studied my methods. Which means I need to stop thinking like Specter Six and start thinking like someone they can't predict." Aisha's eyes widened slightly. "You're talking about doing the unexpected, breaking your own rules." Elara nodded, checking her weapon, her mind already racing through possibilities. "I taught counterinsurgency snipers to prioritize civilian safety, minimize collateral damage, take the high ground literally and morally. So now I do the opposite. Not by becoming reckless, but by thinking like someone who never trained under me." The distinction was razor-thin but crucial. She wasn't abandoning her principles. She was abandoning her patterns. At dawn, Elara did something Specter Six would never do. She walked into an open valley floor, no cover, completely exposed, her rifle slung across her back in plain view. Aisha watched from a concealed position 200 meters away, her scope trained on the surrounding ridges, her heart probably trying to punch through her chest. This was insanity by every tactical standard Elara had ever taught. A sniper's survival depended on invisibility, distance, and perfect positioning. Walking into the open was suicide, which was exactly why she was doing it. Because her enemy expected Specter Six, careful, methodical, ghost-like. They didn't expect a woman who'd stopped caring about the legends and started caring about ending this nightmare. The valley was silent except for wind and her own breathing. Each step felt deliberate, measured, like walking a tightrope over an abyss. Somewhere in these mountains, enemy eyes watched her through scope glass, finger on trigger, calculating the shot. But they weren't taking it. Seconds stretched into minutes as Elara walked deeper into the valley, her body a target no sniper could resist. Still nothing. Why? The question burned in her mind even as her instincts screamed at her to find cover. Then understanding crashed through her like cold water. They weren't shooting because this was too easy, too obvious. They suspected a trap, thought she was bait for a larger operation, waited for helicopters or support teams to reveal themselves. Her enemy was smart enough to question good fortune. "Major, you have movement on the North Ridge." Aisha's voice crackled in her earpiece, barely above a whisper. Single individual, civilian clothing, but moving with military precision toward a position that would give them clear shot at your extraction route. Not her current position, her extraction route. They were thinking 3 moves ahead, positioning to kill her when she tried to leave the valley. Elara kept walking, showing no sign she'd heard, no change in her steady pace. In her peripheral vision, she spotted what she was looking for. A small cluster of ruins, maybe an old shepherd's hut collapsed by time and weather, providing just enough cover if she could reach it. Not perfect cover, not sniper-approved cover, but enough. She stumbled, intentional but looking accidental, going down on one knee as if she'd twisted her ankle. The moment of vulnerability, real or perceived, was irresistible to a predator. The shot came from the East Ridge, not the north where their spotter had positioned. 2 snipers, coordinated, waiting for weakness. The bullet cracked past her head close enough to feel its heat. Elara didn't freeze. She rolled, came up running in a serpentine pattern no one could maintain forever, but she only needed 15 meters. Rock exploded around her, 2 shooters firing now, bracketing her with precision that would have been impressive if it wasn't trying to end her life. She dove behind the ruins as a third shot punched through where her head had been a heartbeat before. Got them both. Aisha's voice, sharp with controlled excitement. North Ridge, 700 meters. East Ridge, 920. Confirming 2 shooters, both repositioning after firing. Elara pressed against the cold stone of the ruins, her heart hammering but her mind ice-calm in that way combat brought out in her. 2 snipers, both now revealed, both knowing their positions were compromised. They'd have to move or risk Aisha taking them from her concealed position. This was the moment, the brief window where hunted became hunter. Elara unslung her rifle, brought it to ready position, and began calculating angles with the same cold precision she'd once used to save lives. Now she'd use it to end this nightmare. Through her scope, she caught movement on the North Ridge. A figure in civilian clothes scrambling behind an outcrop, moving fast but not panicked. Professional, trained, and in 3 seconds, they'd be in her crosshairs with nowhere left to hide. Her fingers settled on the trigger, and somewhere in the cold morning air, she could almost hear Christmas carols from 7 years ago, reminding her that every choice carried weight that never truly disappeared. She squeezed the trigger, felt the rifle's kick against her shoulder, watched through her scope as the figure crumpled. 1 down. The East Ridge sniper was already moving, smart enough to know staying still meant death. But Elara was Specter Six, and Specter Six never let them get away. She shifted aim, calculated for a moving target behind partial cover, and fired again. The mountains echoed with thunder, and the second figure fell. Silence crashed over the valley like a wave, profound and terrible. Aisha's voice in her earpiece. Both targets down. Confirm kills. Elara lowered her rifle, hands steady despite what she'd just done, and realized with crystalline clarity that she'd never truly stopped being a weapon. She'd just been pretending for 7 years that weapons could choose to be something else. They reached the North Ridge position 20 minutes later, moving with tactical caution despite the silence. The figure lay crumpled behind the outcrop exactly where Elara's bullet had found them. Aisha approached first, weapon ready, then froze. "Major, you need to see this." Elara moved forward, her rifle at low ready, and looked down at the person she'd killed. Then her world inverted. The enemy sniper was a woman, maybe 30 years old, with features that suggested Middle Eastern and European ancestry blended into something that belonged everywhere and nowhere. But that wasn't what made Elara's breath catch. It was the equipment. The rifle was a custom M24, virtually identical to her own. The scope configuration matched her preferred setup. Even the way the woman had positioned her gear, ammunition here, water there, medical kit in this exact pocket, mirrored Elara's own methodology with eerie precision. "Check her gear," Elara said quietly, something cold forming in her stomach. Aisha rifled through the woman's pack while Elara stood guard, though no threat remained except the questions piling up like snow. Aisha pulled out a tablet, powered it on, and her face went pale. "Ma'am, you need to see this right now." The tablet displayed files, hundreds of them. After-action reports from Specter Six operations. Training videos Elara had made for counterinsurgency sniper courses. Personal photos from her service record that should have been classified beyond reach. And emails. Dozens of emails between this woman and someone using a government server address, someone with high-level security clearance discussing operational details, targeting priorities, and specific methodologies that only existed in classified databases. "She wasn't just copying you," Aisha whispered, scrolling through the files with growing horror. "Someone gave her your entire playbook. Someone inside our own command structure." The implications crashed through Elara like artillery fire. This wasn't enemy action. This was betrayal from within, someone using her techniques to undermine American operations, kill American soldiers, and turn her methodology into a weapon against the very people she'd sworn to protect. The woman at her feet wasn't the enemy. She was a contractor, a tool hired and trained and aimed at targets by someone who understood that the best way to destroy Specter Six legacy was to turn it into a murder weapon. They moved to the East Ridge position. The second sniper was male, younger, with similar equipment and the same unnerving familiarity with Elara's methods. His pack contained identical files plus one additional item, a burner phone with a single contact saved under the name Architect. The last message, sent 3 hours before their confrontation, read, "Target confirmed in Valley. Proceeding with engagement. Payment upon completion." Payment. These weren't ideological warriors or enemy combatants. They were hired killers given Specter Six playbook and pointed at American soldiers like smart bombs with her signature all over them. Elara stood on that frozen ridge, looking down at two bodies that represented someone's calculated plan to destroy everything she'd built, and felt rage burn through the cold. "The Architect," she said quietly, holding the burner phone like it was a live grenade. "Someone with access to classified files, government servers, operational planning. Someone who knows me well enough to predict my moves and counter them." Aisha's face was grim. Someone in General Thorne's command structure. Maybe someone in that briefing room when he demanded your call sign. The list of suspects was small but terrifying: colonels, majors, intelligence officers, all people she'd worked with, trusted, maybe even trained. One of them was the Architect, using her legend to kill her brothers and sisters in arms. And they'd keep doing it until she stopped them, which meant going back to base and hunting an enemy who wore an American uniform and knew every move she'd make. "We extract. Now," Elara said, already moving, her mind racing ahead to the confrontation that was coming. "And we bring this evidence straight to General Thorne before the Architect knows we've survived." They moved through the mountains faster than tactical doctrine recommended, driven by the knowledge that somewhere behind them, a traitor was probably already getting reports that their hired killers had missed. Every minute counted. Every second brought them closer to base and closer to the moment when Specter Six would have to become a weapon one final time. Not against enemy combatants in distant mountains, but against betrayal wearing a familiar face. As they ran, snow began falling again, covering their tracks, covering the bodies behind them, covering everything in white like the world was trying to pretend violence could be buried and forgotten. But Elara had learned long ago that some stains never washed away, no matter how much snow fell. Some choices marked you forever, and some weapons, once forged, could never truly be unmade. They could only choose their targets and hope they aimed at something worth hitting. The briefing room felt different this time. Smaller, more claustrophobic, filled with officers whose faces Elara now studied with predator's eyes instead of soldiers' trust. General Thorne sat at the head of the table, the burner phone and tablet evidence spread before him like accusations. 6 officers lined the walls. Colonel Marcus Webb, intelligence officer, whose career she'd helped build with her after-action reports. Major Sandra Okoye, operations, who'd coordinated half her Specter Six missions. Captain Devin Marsh, communications, young enough to be ambitious and old enough to be dangerous. And 3 others whose names she knew but whose hearts remained mysteries. One of them was the Architect. One of them had turned her legacy into a weapon aimed at American soldiers. One of them was about to be exposed, and desperation made people unpredictable as nitroglycerin. "These files were stolen from classified servers," General Thorne said, his voice carrying the weight of betrayal that ran deeper than enemy action. "Someone with high-level clearance accessed Specter Six operational records and sold them to contractors who used Major Voss's methodology to kill 12 of our people." He looked up, his eyes moving across each face with the cold assessment of a man who trusted these officers with American lives. "Someone in this room is responsible. Someone here is the Architect." The silence that followed felt like the moment before an avalanche. Everything suspended in terrible anticipation. Elara watched them carefully. Not their faces, which trained officers could control, but their bodies. The small tells that revealed true thoughts. Colonel Webb's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Major Okoye's fingers drummed once against her thigh before stilling. Captain Marsh's breathing quickened slightly, then deliberately slowed. Normal reactions to accusation or signs of guilt. The burner phone contains communications with a government server, Aisha added from her position by the door, her rifle slung but her hand near it in a way that suggested she trusted no one here. We can trace the IP address, match it to terminal usage logs. The architect will be identified within hours. A gambit, a calculated lie designed to force the guilty party's hand. Because the truth was the IP was routed through proxies that would take days to unravel, maybe weeks. But the architect didn't know that. And someone desperate might make a move that revealed themselves. Elara watched, counting heartbeats. 1, 2, 3. Captain Marsh stood abruptly. This is insane. We're special operations officers, not traitors. His voice carried the ring of genuine outrage, but his hand moved toward his sidearm in a way that suggested less about self-defense and more about making sure no one left this room alive to testify. Everything happened in the span of 3 seconds that stretched like hours. Marsh's hand reached his holster. Elara moved on instinct refined by years of impossible shots and split-second decisions. Her hand caught his wrist before the weapon cleared leather, twisted with leverage that made strength irrelevant, and slammed him face-first into the wall with enough force to crack plaster and maybe his orbital bone. The room exploded into motion. Officers reaching for weapons, Aisha swinging her rifle to cover the room, General Thorne shouting for stand down in a voice that probably stopped bar fights in his youth. Elara had Marsh's arm pinned behind his back at an angle that promised dislocation if he moved, her other hand against his neck in a grip that controlled blood flow to the brain. "Don't," she whispered, close enough to his ear that only he could hear. "Don't make me add you to the count of people I've killed. Don't make your mother bury you as a traitor instead of a soldier." Marsh went still. The fight drained from him like water from a punctured canteen, leaving only the hollow exhaustion of someone who'd bet everything and lost. "You don't understand," he said, his voice muffled against the wall. "The program was corrupt. Specter Six killed people based on intelligence that was sometimes wrong, sometimes politically motivated. I was trying to expose that by showing what happens when those same methods are used without moral oversight." Elara felt something crack inside her chest, not because his reasoning was entirely wrong, but because it was just true enough to hurt. She had killed based on intelligence she trusted, made decisions with incomplete information, operated in moral gray areas that haunted her long after missions ended. But the solution to imperfect justice was never more killing, never turning her methods into weapons against the very soldiers trying to do better. "You killed 12 people to make a point," General Thorne said, standing now, his face carved from granite and old rage. 12 soldiers who were building schools, training police, trying to win hearts instead of destroying them. "You killed the best of us to prove a philosophy thesis about the worst of us." He nodded to Aisha, who moved forward with zip ties. Marsh didn't resist as they bound his hands. His eyes found Elara's, and in them she saw something like understanding, like maybe he'd expected her of all people to appreciate his twisted logic. "You could have been different," he said as they led him toward the door, toward military police and courts-martial and the disgrace that would follow him forever. Specter Six could have refused the bad missions, questioned the intelligence, stopped being a weapon. But you just kept shooting. The door closed behind him, but his words lingered like cordite smoke after gunfire. 3 months later, Elara stood at Arlington National Cemetery watching snowfall on graves too numerous to count. She'd come to visit the 12 soldiers killed by Marsh's contractors, to stand in the cold and bear witness to the weight of choices that rippled across years and lives and families torn apart. Each headstone represented someone's child, someone's parent, someone's friend who'd believed goodness could survive in war zones and paid for that belief with everything. Fresh flowers lay on several graves despite the winter, placed by families who still came to talk to stone and frozen ground, because it was the only place left where their loved ones existed. The sight broke something in her that hadn't been broken on any battlefield, in any moment when she'd squeezed a trigger and watched through a scope as someone crumpled. General Thorne found her there, his uniform dusted with snow, his face showing every one of his 63 years. They stood in silence for a while, 2 soldiers who'd sent people to kill and die and were still trying to figure out if that made them protectors or just well-intentioned weapons. "Captain Marsh was sentenced this morning," the general said finally. Life in Leavenworth, no possibility of parole. Dishonorable discharge. His mother was in the courtroom. Elara nodded, not trusting herself to speak. He was wrong, Thorne continued. But he wasn't entirely wrong. The Specter Six program operated in spaces where right and wrong got blurry. Sometimes the intelligence was perfect. Sometimes it wasn't. And you were the one holding the rifle either way. I know, Elara said quietly, her breath creating frost ghosts that disappeared into falling snow. I've known for 7 years. That's why I walked away. She turned to face him, this general who'd pulled her back into being a weapon when her country needed it. So why did you bring me back? Why resurrect Specter Six when you knew what it cost? General Thorne was silent for a long moment, his eyes moving across the endless rows of graves. Because sometimes we need weapons, Major. Not because it's good or right or just, but because the alternative is worse. Those 12 soldiers died because I didn't have someone with your skills hunting the hunters. If I'd brought you back sooner, maybe some of them would still be here, still building schools and changing hearts. Is that worth the cost of who you have to become? The question hung between them like smoke, like the snow falling on graves, like every hard choice Elara had ever made. She thought about the Russian captain in Skinvali, about the Taliban fighters on Christmas Eve, about Marsh's contractors crumpled on frozen ridges. She thought about the children who'd opened presents because she'd pulled a trigger, and the families now visiting graves because someone else had. The mathematics of killing to save lives defied simple calculation. Some equations had no right answer, just choices you had to live with or break beneath. I don't know, she admitted, the most honest thing she'd said in months. I don't know if it's worth it. I only know I'm the one who has to carry it. General Thorne handed her a folder, its contents heavy with implications. One more mission. There's a human trafficking network operating across 3 countries. Local authorities can't touch them, too connected, too protected. But someone with your skills could take out the leadership in one coordinated operation. Save maybe 200 women and children from lives worse than death. He met her eyes, and in his face she saw the same burden she carried, the weight of decisions that required turning people into weapons because sometimes weapons were needed. I'm not ordering you. I'm asking. Can Specter Six do one more good thing before you bury her for real? Elara took the folder, felt its weight like carrying someone's life in her hands. Inside would be target packages, intelligence assessments, probably photographs of men who deserved what was coming. And photographs of victims whose salvation required her to become, one more time, the weapon she'd never truly stopped being. I need a condition, she said, holding the folder but not opening it. After this mission, you help me build something better. A program that trains snipers not just to shoot but to question, to verify intelligence independently, to refuse bad missions without facing court-martial. You let me turn Specter Six from a legend about perfect kills into a lesson about imperfect choices and how to make them better. It was ambitious, maybe impossible, definitely naive. But General Thorne smiled, tired and genuine. Deal. Save those people, then come back and teach us how to question orders while still serving the mission. Teach us how to be weapons that think. They shook hands in the snow, over graves of soldiers who died in a war that never truly ended, surrounded by the quiet weight of sacrifice that marked every stone. Elara looked at the folder in her hand, then back at the headstones with their fresh flowers and frozen ground. Merry Christmas, she whispered to the 12 graves that had pulled her back into being Specter Six. I don't know if this makes it right. I don't know if anything makes it right, but I'll try to make it count. Then she turned and walked through the falling snow toward a helicopter waiting to take her to another war. Another set of targets. Another chance to be the weapon that saved lives at the cost of who she might have been if the world was different. Behind her, snow continued falling on Arlington, covering everything in white, making the world look clean and new for a few hours before the truth showed through again. Some stains never washed away. Some choices marked you forever. And some people were forged into weapons not because they wanted to be, but because when children were trapped and monsters were hunting and someone had to pull the trigger, Specter Six never missed. Not on Christmas Eve in Georgian mountains. Not on Christmas morning in Afghan valleys. and not on whatever day came next when the world needed someone willing to carry the weight of impossible choices and still try to aim at something worth hitting. The helicopter lifted off into gray winter sky, carrying the legendary Christmas sniper toward one more mission, one more chance to turn violence into salvation, knowing that every life saved was also a piece of herself she'd never get back. But then she thought maybe that was always the price. Maybe weapons, even the ones that thought and questioned and carried the weight of their choices, were never truly meant to be whole. They were meant to be sharp. And Specter Six had always been the sharpest blade her country could forge, even if it cut her own hands holding it. The end.